Hey everyone, my name is Matt. Welcome to my shop and welcome to my series on building this Serpentine chest of drawers, which is built just like any other chest of drawers, except for this crazy S-curve on the front, which definitely complicates things a little bit. And before we get started, I want to say a big thank you to Triton Tools for sponsoring this build and continue to support the channel as they have over the last several years. Throughout the series, I'll be telling you about some of their products as we go, but for now, we're going to hop back into the design. So let's go all the way back in time to the beginning. So after some time on, I think, either Google or Pinterest, I found this serpentine chest, which I really like as the foundation to what I have in mind. There's a few details on here that kind of speak to me, I guess. One of the things is the fact that the corner does not have a flat kind of area on it, or I guess sort of a 45-degree angled flat area. That's what you'll see on a lot of serpentine cabinets. They'll have a corner detail. I don't really care for that. I really want to have this nice crisp look where it looks like a normal chest of drawers, but the whole side is kind of bent and curved. I really like that. I like the kind of pointiness of the corner, especially here on the top. So that's the kind of starting point for what I'm trying to do here. There's a few details that I will be changing. One of the things you'll see on here is the drawers themselves have a cock beading. I'm going to try and move the beading detail to the dividers and leave the drawer fronts just flush. The cock beading is going to be a great detail if you're doing a veneered front, because that cock beading gets applied to all the sides, so you can't see the seam between the base material and then your veneer layer. But the way I want to do it, the drawer fronts are going to be sawn out of solid stock, and I think having the bead detail onto the dividers will be kind of an interesting look. The biggest thing with that bead on there is it really just allows you to have a little bit of tolerance there in case there's any issues with the alignment of the curvature of all the drawers and all of the dividers. Because if the curves are off a little bit and things aren't perfectly flush, it doesn't really matter because you can't tell that because there is a bead detail there that sort of interferes with the flat facade of the front of the cabinet. So coming back to this view again, so from the front, if you didn't have the look of the curvature, it would look like a very standard chest of drawers, which I like. So it is like a standard chest of drawers, but just elevated a little bit in complexity because the front is not flat. So I really like that. So that's really it for the starting point. The nice thing here is this website, this sales page, has the overall dimensions, so we can kind of use those to figure out some sort of plan for the overall size of the case. So let's just talk about the depth first. That is going to be the deepest part of the case. It's either going to be the top or down here on the Ozu bracket feet. So it is 23.5. I think we're going to aim for an overall depth of 24. And then to figure out the actual depth of like the case side, that's just going to be the top minus the overhang. So if I have 1.5 inch overhang, the depth of the actual case is going to be 22.5. So just looking at the main core case of the piece, this dimension here is going to be 22.5 inches deep. And again, with these dimensions, a lot of the overall ones can vary depending on the lumber. So these are kind of best case scenarios, and we can always adjust things as we go to the actual wood. Now for the overall width of the case, this one here is 41. I think just a standard 36-inch wide case is going to be the easiest. So I'm going to call the width of the case 36. And then by the time we have the overhangs, it'll be closer to 40. So it should be around the same size. Now the last one is going to be the overall height. And that's going to give us an opportunity to figure out what our drawer graduations are going to be. So the overall height on this one is 34 inches. If you start taking a look here, if you take 6 inches for the feet, that's going to take us down to 28, and then you can start dividing out the material that's going to be used up for the dividers and the top from there. So the 6 inches minus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dividers plus a top, those are all going to be 3/4. So 6 times 3/4, it's going to be 4.5. We're going to add that to the 6 we already took off. So we have 10.5 inches of like used up space that can't be drawers. So that leaves us with a total of 23.5 inches that we can divide up into 4 graduated drawers. So with just a little bit of kind of figuring, I guess, we have a 7.5 inch bottom drawer, a 6.5 inch second from the bottom, 5.25, and then 4.25. So that should be a nice step as we go up. And then one little detail I need here is going to be the overall height of the case side, which is fairly easy too. You take this 23.5 and you add in all of the dividers. So that's 5 3/4 inch dividers. And actually, before I forget, the bottom is going to have a false bottom or a false divider, which we'll see will make the molding detail there a little bit easier. So there's actually 2 dividers on the bottom. So we'll add another 3/4. So the case side is 28 inches tall. Now with those numbers figured out, that's like the core of the entire project. From here, it all kind of builds onto itself. So I can figure out from this the size of the panels I'm going to need for the 2 sides and the top and the bottom based on the joinery that I'm going to cut. And that's basically how I'm going to start the project. A lot of people ask me like how much I draw out a project before actually jumping into the wood. This is really about it. I'll either do this on paper like I did here, or I'll do something similar to this in SketchUp just to give me my starting point, and then I can go from there. So unless I have to have a project virtually figured out to show as a demonstration before starting, this is as far as I will take it. So real quick, I'll get the size of these panels. The top is going to be a little bit different than the bottom. The bottom will be the full width of the case because it will be a through dovetail joint. The top is going to be held back 1/4 inch from that width because it's going to be a half blind. That's going to give me 1/8 inch of a step for the half blind. So now that we have an idea for the size of the box that we're going to make, we have to come up with the actual shape for the box, which is that the S curve that goes in the front there, the serpentine curve. And I have this one here, which I came up with, and I'll show you how I arrived at this in a little bit. I thought first we just run through some of the very common curve drawing tools we have in the shop to help lay out these things and make your work all not straight, curvy. So first up is going to be the most common thing that I reach for when I want to design a curve, and that's going to be a drawing bow. So a drawing bow is simply just a flexible strip that has some way to flex it and keep it in whatever position you put it in. This one is from Lee Valley. It has a little adjustable strap on the back here, so you can tighten and loosen it to give you whatever your curve is that you're kind of looking for. This yellow one is a symmetrical curve, so it's symmetrical across its entire length. This one right here is asymmetrical, so you can see that it actually kind of tapers at this end down here. And the way the asymmetrical bow works is that one end of the strip is thicker than the other, so that gives you an asymmetrical arc when you actually draw it into a bow. A drawing bow is also a fairly simple shop project, so here's one that I made, just a strip of wood with a string in here. I have it on a slip knot so I can adjust the amount of a flex in the bow. And again, you can do the same thing here. You can do a symmetrical bow, or you can do an asymmetrical one by having a strip that's tapered in thickness. So those are drawing bows. Next up is going to be a French curve. These are going to come in a variety of different shapes. This is just one of them, but the idea here is you find a section of the curve that you like and you incorporate that little bit of the curve into your work. These are commonly available as drafting supplies, so from like art suppliers, you would find these as well as like drafting squares and things like that. A size like this is pretty good for smaller projects, but for a piece of furniture, it tends to be a bit on the small side. So for furniture, a much bigger French curve can be far more useful because you have a bigger thing to work with. So on a piece of furniture, this would probably be a lot more useful to lay out a curve than this is. You could use this and scale it up to something that will work, but having a full size, a giant French curve can also be very, very helpful. This one here is from Lee Valley. They have a XL size French curve kit. So here's some of the other larger sizes as well. And again, with this, you would figure out, okay, I like this area of the curve here. I'm going to use this little area here in my work. And lastly is going to be a compass if you want to work in terms of true radii, so perfect semicircles. This is going to be the tool for that. The French curves and the drawing bows are going to give you arcs, but they're not going to be consistent or even. This is going to give you an actual semicircle segment. If you want to go bigger than this, you could use a trammel. Once you get into those really, really big arcs, it starts getting a little bit, not super feasible. But if you're working in semicircles, one of these guys is going to be very helpful for that. So now that we have our layout tools, we can use them to create some kind of serpentine curve that we actually like. So let me walk you through the process of coming up with this thing. This whole process just starts off as a grid that will provide some guidelines for the curves. I'll draw 2 lines which will establish the thickness of the blanks that I'll use for the drawer fronts, which are going to be 2 inches thick. I'll lay out the extent of the case, so that's going to be 36 inches, and then mark the center line. I'll next mark the finished thickness of the drawer front in the middle and the ends. This will reference from the front of the blanks, and then I'll mark the finished thickness down in the areas which will be the valleys. These marks will ensure that the curve I come up with can actually produce a drawer front out of my 2-inch stock. With a finished thickness of 3/4 inches and a blank thickness of 2 inches, my serpentine curve can travel 1 1/4 inches through the stock's thickness. Now I can start playing around with some curves. On this side, I'm using a symmetrical curve in the middle and an asymmetrical curve at the ends. The inflection point just needs a little bit of finessing. On the other side, I use a symmetrical curve for both. I'll split them into 2 half templates and then start cutting them out to see which one will speak to me. Once I have the shape cut out of the bandsaw, I can start refining it with a Trident oscillating spindle and belt sander. An oscillating sander like this is extremely helpful for curved work, so we'll be coming back to this tool many times and we'll take a closer look at it in the future. This time I thought we'd talk about the Trident Super Jaws. When Trident first came on as a sponsor, I was building my sawmill. That was 5 years ago, and I didn't have a whole lot of room in the shop to do a lot of these things, so one of the first Trident products I had a lot of experience with was the Super Jaws. These created a really functional work area in the driveway for me. So anytime I needed them, they were there, ready to go. I can hold anything, I can clamp things, I can do all kinds of stuff and not be inside the actual shop. Most of the things I clamp are pretty small, but the jaw is reversible for clamping larger objects. If you wanted to work on a door, for example, you could hold that in the jaws, or if you wanted to create a large work surface, you could clamp a piece of plywood in the jaws and have a nice work surface wherever you are. And those are the Super Jaws, one of my favorite Trident products. With those 2 half templates cut out, I can convert them to full templates, and it's at this point that I decided I liked the fully symmetrical one better and didn't bother to cut out the full one of the symmetrical and asymmetrical version. The last step to make this my master template going forward is going to be to fair the curves and do the last little bit of finesse work. I'm using a marker to make tracking my progress easier. The marker will hang around in the low spots, making them very obvious. I'm also trying to keep the 2 sides of the template as close to the same as possible. I'll establish left and right and use those throughout the project to mitigate the error, but it would be nice if the serpentine curve at least looks visually symmetrical left to right. So now that we have a pretty much mostly fleshed out design, we can move forward and take a look at the lumber next. So the primary material on this project is going to be walnut. Secondary material is going to be maple, which we'll grab in a second. Before we actually talk a little bit about the boards, I have laid out here a little bit of the history for this. So the log for this I picked up in a video a few years ago. That was a log that was laying down in a really tight access backyard. It was laying down a hill and there was a garage in the way. I picked that up and I brought it home, and then the sawing of that log happened in my series on turning a log into lumber. Part 1, we focused on cutting boards out of logs, and that was the 4/4 material that I'm using for this project. Part 2 was a little bit of a different approach to sawing, how to saw slabs for interesting figure and grains and shapes and things. So that was part 2. That's going to be the slabs we'll be using for the drawer fronts because they're thicker. They're a little over 8/4. And then part 3 of that series covered the stacking and drying of this lumber. And then a project that I already made from this tree was a dressing vanity, and I will leave you a link to all of them videos if you want to take a look at the history to this point. So I have a pair of book mash boards, which is going to give me the material for the sides and the top. That's really the only large primary visible panels you're going to have in this project. Top and bottom can be secondary material, so we don't really have to worry about that too much. And not a whole lot of crazy things going on here. I'm trying to avoid sapwood a little bit here because I'm trying to go for more of a traditional type of feel. So I should have enough width here to remove this bit of sap here in the middle, join these 2 together and have a nice panel for the sides. The top may not work out that way, but I'm not super worried about that. The top isn't actually needed for a while anyway. One little issue I am having though is that for the sides to be 28, I am going to be into these knots here, which on this piece I don't really want. So what will end up probably happening is I'll cut this a little bit wide or a little bit long for now, and we'll kind of see where things end up at. I do have a little bit of flexibility because the bottom of the case is going to be covered by that molding down there, so I have about 3/4 of an inch of coverage onto whatever face. So if I start at the top of the panel right beneath this knot, I can come down to this area of the knot here, and that should be hidden later on, but we will see. Otherwise, the case just shrinks down a little bit, which isn't a big deal either. So those are the sides, the top, and then for some of the divider stock I've already laid out here. That's a little bit more, I guess, interesting and thoughtful. So you can see this board I'm going to use for the divider stock. I'll rip it into these strips here, and this is from towards the outside of the log. You can see it's pretty narrow and sappy through here, which is perfect for this kind of stock because I want to use as flat sawn stock as possible for this, because I want the front edge, that front edge you're going to see against the drawers, to be a nice straight grain. So if this is perfectly flat sawn, that edge will be quarter sawn and therefore straight, or somewhere close to that. It could still be rift sawn or something, but I won't have cathedrals in the front of the case, so I'll be able to have the focus on the drawer fronts themselves. So I have these set up for the cut here to run right through the pith area where the tree's actually growing. It's not parallel to the edge of the board. You can see that one down there is at a pretty big angle. So that's going to give me a nice chunk of nice heartwood area, and there'll be some sapwood towards the back, but that'll be the inside of the case. Doesn't really matter. And out here in the middle, that should be the flattest sawn area, because you can see the cathedrals, perfect cathedrals like this. If you cut through this, the edge should be very, very straight. So we'll take a look at that once these get milled up. So as I mentioned, the drawer fronts are going to come from the slab material. This is an offcut from the dressing vanity, but I have the rest of the slabs from that log. This will give us a lot of interesting things to kind of play with, and give us a thickness to cut that serpentine pattern into the drawer front. I'm not going to do the drawer layout right now. I'm going to set this aside for now, and we can worry about that later when we get more towards that. For this video and for this kind of first process, I just want to be making the case. So that's going to be the case sides, the case bottom and top, and then all the dividers. So that's the only thing I'm really looking for right now. So I'm going to grab the secondary material. We'll get some of that laid out, and it's time to start chopping stuff up. Finally. Cutting wood. So this layout is going to be pretty simple because there's not a whole lot of artistry to this. These boards are plenty wide already. This one's got some kind of rot going on down here, so I will work to eliminate that. So this first one will be this here, and then come down to what about here. Cut that, glue them together, and that's one panel. And it's going to be kind of the same deal over here. Easy to get cut and then joined back together. Now there's one small little difference, I guess, with this between the top and the bottom. The top is going to be edged with some walnut because that is going to be exposed. That's going to have a serpentine in it. So I have this offcut from the dressing vanity, and I'll probably just end up doing a very similar thing to the dividers. Just coming in here and cutting somewhere in here, and then gluing this piece onto the front edge of the top. And I'll give you my walnut strip there. This guy, while I was out there, I figured I'd pull it out and start cutting it up now. This is going to be the drawer runners that support the drawers. Goes from the front to the back. So nothing super crazy here. These are about 2 feet long, and this one's got this kind of crack in it right here. So I'm just gonna cut this up now and get it out of the way, and we'll make a bunch of drawer runner support things for the case. So that leaves me with just the rear dividers for the case. So I'm gonna grab a board for that, and that's not gonna be anything super crazy. It's just gonna be like the dividers for the front. This one, except the fact that we don't really care what the grain's doing because it's only structural and it'll never be seen. So I'm not gonna go through that. I'm just gonna start cutting these things up and milling everything down. The only two boards I'm not going to mill up right away is going to be the two boards for the top. Everything else is going to get milled to rough dimension for now. I'll let it rest for a few days, and then we'll come back and make panels out of everything. And from there, it'll finally be time to do some maybe woodworking. I mean, I guess milling boards up, you know, jointing and planing stuff is woodworking, but I kind of associate woodworking with, you know, not just milling stuff, maybe like cutting joinery and stuff like that. So everything is rough milled. As you can see, I still have some mill marks here and there. So these are going to sit and rest for a few days. That's going to allow them to detension and de-stress and warp if they're going to warp a little more before we bring them back into flat and bring them down to final thickness. While these are sitting around, I like to just have them either leaning up against the bench like this or on edge. That's going to allow airflow on all sides of the board so they can acclimate and readjust to their new environment. This is when I'll also do my epoxy fills, so I'll get rid of that step now. That way when we do the final milling, the milling process cleans up the epoxy and it's all good to go from there. We'll do that in a second, but since we have the drawer dividers all cleaned up now, I thought I'd give you a little better view of how that green orientation is going to work on these guys. So this is the cut line which I drew, which is right down the center of the board, right where the growth rings come to their apex. So right here at the cut, the growth rings are pretty much flat and parallel to the face. But more importantly, they are perpendicular to the edge. So this edge here is actually quarter sawn. Now for this project, I don't really need quarter sawn grain. I just need a straight grain. So if the growth rings are at a slight angle or something, that'd be fine too. But just kind of a fun way to play with the grain. If you understand how the grains can present itself to the face, depending on the orientation of the growth rings, you can really play around with things and get things to work out exactly as you want. So now let's take care of a few little defect fillings. On a lot of these, my defects don't go all the way through, so I don't have to do a whole lot of masking. Some of them I do, however. So to fill the defects, I'm going to use Total Boat's traditional 5:1 epoxy. And I'm going to use this tiny cup because this one is kind of big. I don't quite need that much epoxy for that. So this mixes at 5:1, and that's really easy to do with these pumps. It's going to dispense the right ratio of epoxy for you every time. And I like to use a brown tint to this, which is going to keep the defect kind of showing a little bit of a shadow line kind of thing. It's not quite black, but it also doesn't really accentuate the fact that there's a defect there. It just kind of looks like there is a more of a shadow line more than anything else. One other thing is I'm using a slow set resin. That's going to give this epoxy plenty of time to flow down into all the nooks and crannies within that crack before starting to cure. I'm not really in a rush with this stuff since I have time, so a slow hardener, it takes about, I don't know, probably 18 hours or so before you can plane these things, and that's plenty for this project. The nice thing about these epoxy systems is you can really vary the mixes and the stuff you put in it to suit your needs. So it truly is a system. So if you wanted a clearer epoxy or a faster setting epoxy or a thicker epoxy, you can do that too. It is the next day. The epoxy is all cured and ready to go. So next we can start making up the actual panels for this project. I'm going to set aside all of the divider stock except for one because we don't need that right now. One piece of the divider stock will be laminated to the front edge of the top, and that's really about it for divider stock for now. So we're going to make 4 panels, 2 sides, top and bottom because we're just making a box. That's really about it. So I'm going to go through the milling process again, bring all these back into flat. Don't look like they move much at all, but just in case, bring them back into flat, plane them down to final thickness, and then we can start laying them out and prepping them for all of the edge jointing to get these ready for glue up. So after a little bit of work to finalize these things, we're ready to glue them up into actual panels. And this is where my, I guess, obsession with having things nice and flat really comes in. Because if you have flat workpieces, all your joinery is going to be a lot easier and you'll have less problems and less hassles. And there's no more fundamental furniture joint than this one right here, the edge joint panel glue up. This one is one of the ones that causes people the most amount of grief, but if you have boards that are flat, you can get the edges nice and straight. This process becomes almost effortless, and you don't have to worry about the wood fighting you anymore. You can just work with the wood and enjoy it. So having these boards flat means they'll sit nice and flat in the clamps, and I won't have to put any cauls on anything, and everything just kind of ends up nice and perfect. Now, one little trick with this too is when you're doing your actual edge jointing, you can run opposite faces against the fence. That's going to cut a complementary angle onto the edge of the board. So if your fence is not perfectly square, you can account for that really easily this way. And it's just one of those workflow things that if you just do make a habit of, it'll eliminate errors and potential problems in your workflow and make things a lot more easy. So here's an example of a complementary angle. We've all seen a picture frame kind of 45-degree angles like this. So if your fence was really out of square and you ran both boards with the same face against the fence, you'd end up with something like this. And when you try and clamp the boards together, you're going to try and close that gap, and your panel is going to have this angle thing going on in it. But if you reverse that and you clamp them up this way now they are complementary, the error is canceled out, and everything works nice and perfectly. So the other thing with this is the edge joint off the jointer is nice and straight, so I don't need a whole heck of a lot of pressure to actually close this up. The more pressure you have to apply, the more that pressure is going to tweak your panel out of square, out of flat, and you're going to have even more problems. So all I have to do is just hold the boards down to the clamp bodies and just apply a, a light bit of pressure just to fully close the gap and get a little bit of squeeze out so we know that the edges are actually coming together nicely. The other thing I'm looking at on this panel is my alignment. Since I'm book matched, I just want to make sure that the grain kind of matches up nicely where it meets, and then leave it alone. All right, I have a few more panels to do. It should be pretty quick, and then that'll be it for panels, I guess. And that takes care of the panels. And one last little tip for you is if you're going to have your panels sitting around for a bit before you can start cutting your joinery on them, stack them on a flat surface and keep something on top of them. This is going to prevent air from getting at the surface of the panels and keep them from warping. So if you can't get to your joinery right away, this is a great way to keep your panels nice and flat between all the stages. Once the joinery is cut, it's not a huge deal because the joinery will actually pull the panels back into flat if they do move. So I'll stack the panels on the workbench and throw some sheet goods on top of them, and that'll keep the panels from warping overnight before it's time to cut the joinery. So I think it's a pretty good stopping point. We have our panels here all ready to go for joinery, which we'll start on next time. If you like these little more in-depth videos, definitely check out my classes over in the Guild. I have 150 videos like this spread over 9 classes, and today I thought I'd recommend the hand tool cabinet, which is hanging on the wall behind me. Since we talked about design in this video, there's a lot of information about designing a purpose-built piece of furniture. A hand tool cabinet is a great example of that. The cabinet needs to fit all of the tools and feature things and work with the workflow of the user. So there is a lot of detail in that series on design. And if you do want to take on the challenge of making your own Serpentine chest of drawers, I have a full set of plans for this piece over on my website, which you can check out as well. So that is going to do it for this one. Thank you as always for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments on the Serpentine chest of drawers or anything here in the shop, please feel free to leave me a comment. As always, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And until next time, happy woodworking.